So folks, off the bat, I am an engineer, not an astrophysicist. But thank you for the gracious introduction. Now, this is a slide that I typically use to talk to school kids. We have a campaign running called Science Gets You Places, and it is there to prevail upon the youth that they should pursue science with academic vigor. And we try and encourage them that it's pretty cool to do science. Now, if I was told earlier that I would be speaking at this conference, I would have carved out ice letters for something saying design or modeling or something of the sort. But this photo was taken at an area of Antarctica called Union Glacier. And can anyone venture a guess, when was the photo taken at what time of the day? Midnight. This photo was taken at midnight. And what we'll be talking about is designing for a remote environment. So typically, I start this presentation for schools by talking about people like my friend Dr. Hein Reisinger, who studies killer whales. Or I talk about some of the work I do on remote sites in Antarctica, or about a friend of mine, Dr. Rachel Anderson, that is a photo that was taken last year during the Everest season. They were doing some crevasse rescues during the season. For those of you that follow the news, you'd know that it was quite a dismal season at Everest last year. Now, typically I talk about this, and I talk about people like these. So people that use science to get out there and to make a difference. They're typically people that love what they're doing, but all of us need this. If we're doing remote work, we need remote bases, we need field camps and so forth. So these are just some photos of bases that I've either personally lived in, visited, or that some of my friends work in. And most of them are on the ice in Antarctica. So, to give you a quick, succinct background on my personal journey, I started off being a Joburg lightie and then going to Pretoria, studied electronic engineering and specialized in bioelectronic engineering. So my final thesis was to design a computer system called an electroencephalographic controlled mouse. It uses brainwaves to control a mouse on a computer. That's what I wanted to do with engineering, and then I realized it wasn't truly my calling. So I went into telco, spent some years doing telecommunications in Gauteng, and there's a gentleman that once said, you can win the rat race, but you'll still be a rat. Some of you might have lived during his era. But I realized that telco wasn't for me either. So I started looking at options where my engineering career could serve me. And I ended up applying for a national expedition, and ended up going to Antarctica as a space physics engineer on the 50th National Overwintering Team. From there, I've worked with the National Space Agency during the commissioning of some of their geophysics systems on Marion Island. And then in the last 2 summers, I've been staying in a tent working with a company called, or a consortium called Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions. And I'm one of their communications engineering personnel. So I'm going to show you some photos of that. Currently, I am at the helm of a national deployment of a science workshop campaign to uplift grade 11s and matrics for their science exam preparation. So we're running these workshops starting this coming weekend in 12 cities. And that's probably why I look the way I do today. But just to give you a brief outline of the next 18 minutes of your life. And this is for those of you that are die-hard CAD ninjas. This is going to be a bit of a fleeting, superficial chat about basis and why we need to consider design. So this is, if you feel this is not in-depth enough, I do apologize. At least there are pretty pictures. So we'll start with just a succinct look at my personal story, and then we'll look at designing for remote environments. So we'll look at the process that we have to follow to design for these off-site environments, and the process that hopefully leads to avoiding or mitigating these total facepalm moments that you have in the field. To give you an example of a quintessential facepalm moment, and I'm going to, for bureaucratic reasons, I won't divulge any names, but some of my friends were involved in the design of an electric car. And Once the prototypes were built, they called in some engineering friends to appraise the designs. And my immediate question was, why is the charging socket inside the front crumple zone? I mean, if you crash your car, then you can't charge it anymore. It doesn't make any sense. At which point, the engineers started looking at each other, and they had that aha moment. And we try to have those during the build phase and not the deployment phase. So, to jump into the presentation, where my personal journey has taken me to Union Glacier, the white line, close to the South Pole. It's taken me to the National Antarctic Research Base for South Africa, that's the red line, and then to the green line is Marion Island in the Southern Ocean, to the national base over there. That was my home for 15 months. Now, Chris, can I just see a hand? There is a ex-SANAE man in the audience. Chris, lovely meeting you. Now, SANAE old boys, there's not many of us around. Chris also overwintered. He was underground in SANAE 2, I believe. Now, the previous bases were built on the ice shelf, and they used to sink away into the ice as that snow built up. So, Chris, you probably lived underground for a year, 14 months, and didn't see a woman for that entire time. At least, thankfully, I could look at the clear blue skies. Bereft of feminine company, but Facebook was a fantastic resource during that time, and we lived over there. So SANAE 4 was referred to as the Sheraton of Antarctica during its commissioning in the mid-90s. Now, subsequent to that, we've had many similar bases designed, and I'll be touching more on those bases. I have photos from some of my friends that are currently overwintering at those bases, and we'll have a look at them. Now, just to show you a bit about the journey to Antarctica, I'm going to skip over the sciencey things for your sake. This is the voyage. We go through what is referred to as the roaring 40s. So those swell or waves you see over there, during my year, it was a calm year. We had about 15 meters swell. And then after 3 days of going through these massive storms, you end up hitting the ice shelf and the Antarctic waters, and it's just absolutely ethereal. And that's what it looks like as you approach the continent. Then during the summer takeover, you're still a group of scientists, physicists, and a lot of field personnel that occupy the base. There's about 100 of you. And as a young engineer at the time, I was the youngest member of the team. I was cracking about 25. I had to do boring things like bulldozing and firefighting and such things. Now, after the summer takeover, which lasts about 2 months, you have the sun turning over your head for the entirety of that period. You end up backloading to the ship, and then the ship heads off, and you have this interesting moment where you realize that you're all alone, without any girls, without any post offices or shops. You're by yourself, and you're a self-sustaining community. And that's where the base design comes in. That's where you start seeing these little niggles or these things that irk you that you realize could have been solved in the design process. And as a self-sustaining community, we were 10 men in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and we had to make do. So that, for example, is SANAE Dentistry. That was our expedition doctor, Llewellyn Clark, on the left. Our radar engineer broke his molar. And I insisted, our doc had a little mishap with his finger. We won't go into details, but a bit of a cargo work accident, and he was struggling with his work. So I insisted on being his lovely assistant. I'm the guy in the blue overalls. And we rebuilt radar, the engineer's molar. Please excuse the Dutch courage. He was panicking at the time. Any guesses on how many days of dental training our doctor had? 1 on a cadaver. So there wasn't even feedback on his expertise. But thankfully, I avoided the ordeal. So that was us doing dentistry. And then a bit later in the year, our team leader had a spill on the ice. We called him, as you can see from the more hirsute amongst us, we called him the Beard. He was a German South African. Now, he had a spill on the ice. Doctor, once again, had a bit of trouble with his finger, and I insisted on doing the surgeon's knots. Fantastic exposure. Now, that's the kind of things you deal with. You live in a base that has to sustain you. It has to have all the amenities and facilities for emergencies, for the research you do, and for living. So from saunas to games rooms, fridges, and so forth. Now, we ended up encountering some interesting scenarios. And the reason I show you this picture is this is what you're designing for in Antarctica. You can't just build any old structure. Who of you have heard of whiteouts? Some movies to the effect, but we had a bit of trouble with one of our critical systems, and we were forced to go out into a whiteout after a week of having trouble with the system. So we roped up, and 5 of us headed outside the base. We had to go about 500 meters outside. Our comms engineer's eyes froze shut. He's the guy that looks like a Power Ranger on the left. Now, I'm the terrified-looking individual on the bottom right. I sort of hummed to myself all along this 500 meters, and you have about half a meter visibility. So wind speeds in excess of 150 kilometers, getting blown over the whole time, not being able to see your own feet. So now, these are called pampoenskoene for due cause. And they rated to about, Chris, what, minus 35? So these onitsukas, or pampoenskoene as the South Africans call them, are rated to, let's say, minus 35. I could not see them. I could not see my own feet going out into this weather. These Mickey boots are rated to minus 70. They're a standard issue for the South Pole Station. I use them when I do the work in Union Glacier these days. But we design for this kind of environment. Now, during the winter, you have 3 months of winter. Temperatures plummet, and thankfully you have midnight entertainment. We saw quite a couple of absolutely incredible aurora displays, and that was part of my work as a space physics engineer to oversee the systems that monitor these kinds of events. So that's the base in the background. And we won't go into much of the design for the national base. We'll look at some other designs, and I'll explain to you why they are elevated like that. So eventually had first day of sunshine after 3 months of darkness. Absolutely incredible moment. It lasted about 10 minutes, and then the sun nipped down under the horizon, and it got miserably cold, so we went inside again. But it signaled the start of summer, and eventually for summer, we had to go back to the ice shelf and do a lot of work on the ice shelf. So the photo on the top left, end of 2011, it was taken at midnight again, and I actually got sunburn in my nostrils. Being an Antarctic rookie, I'd only been there for 2 summers at the time, and I forgot to apply sunscreen in my nose and under my chin. So that's typically what you encounter on the ice shelf. Absolutely amazing wildlife. So from there, I was commissioned to do some geophysics monitoring systems on Marion Island. So I literally went home, had some Kauai smoothies and sushi, and then that was fantastic. And then ended up going to Marion Island, which is a newly deployed base on the island. Now, just to skip through some of the science behind it, absolute treasure trove of science or scientific data on this base, and there's a myriad different disciplines working on the base. Now, I was part of the space physics division, and once again, the facilities are designed specifically for this environment. So old versus new, you can see the old facilities that are the white buildings and the new facilities. And these are photos that I took just from my office window. Absolute incredible wildlife. This killer whale bull popped out of the water about 4 meters away from me while I was busy working. So that's a fantastic experience as a young engineer.